All right, let's dive in. We are at 1:03 and want to make sure we get as many questions as we can. So a little bit of housekeeping as we get started. My name is Teresa Hebert, and I lead communications here at Quorum. We have a really awesome team of folks from Akin here today to speak on AI policy. As I just mentioned, if you're just joining, throw your questions in the Q&A and vote for your favorites to help us prioritize which questions we get through. So now I want to pass it over to our speakers to introduce themselves. So Hans, I see you're off mute first, so I will have you start.
Sure, and thank you so much, Teresa. It's a pleasure to be with everyone on Friday. I am Hans Rickhoff. I'm a partner here at Akin. I've been here for about 12 years. 6 years ago, we started an Akin AI policy task force. I will tell you, we had a number of events with the AI caucus co-chairs back when there was only a House AI caucus, and we had the director of NIST and others come over, and they were not very well attended. Fast forward to today, we're super excited to be here. We already have over 160 people watching this, and we're excited also that this is an ask me anything type of format. So we don't have the opportunity, it sounds like, to present and filibuster on our own. So we're excited to dive right into the questions. By way of background, I've been here at Akin for about 12 years. Prior to that, I worked with two former members. A million years ago, I worked at the Texas legislature back when it was Governor Bush, not President Bush, and have managed to stick around DC the last 20 plus years. But I'm super excited to be here today with my colleagues, Reggie and Ryan. And I will pass it over to whoever gets off mute first.
Thank you, Hans and Ryan. You're clearly last here. Hello, everyone. I'm Reggie Babin, Senior Counsel here at Akin. I joined the firm a little over a year ago, January of last year, after spending close to a decade on Capitol Hill. I started in the House within Congressman Cedric Richmond from Louisiana and spent the 6 years prior to coming to Akin as counsel and chief counsel to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. And I, in the past year plus, have increasingly focused more and more of my efforts on AI and AI policy, along with my colleagues here and others at the firm. And I'm looking forward to a robust and hopefully informative conversation with you all here today. And Ryan, I'll hand it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Reggie. Good afternoon, everybody. Ryan Thompson. I've been at Akin, similar to Hans, for about 11 years. And prior to that, I spent a decade working as a staffer in the Senate, almost entirely for Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma when he was ranking member of Armed Services and EPW. So excited to join the conversation today, talk about some of the policy overlays of AI, which we're all seeing front and center in the various modes of transportation, defense, et cetera. So Teresa, thanks for having us.
Awesome. And a few last housekeeping things before we dive in. We've got some documents uploaded here in the documents tab with some of Akin's intelligent AI newsletters on some of their recent insights into the industry that you're welcome to read. Also, if we have any media members on the call, this is going to be an off-the-record conversation, but we'd be happy to connect you with the team afterwards if you want to just reply to any of our emails, and we can do that separately. So guys, we've got a ton of questions already, so we're going to dive right in. So our first question: will federal AI regulations in the U.S. get passed before many more states pass state and local regulations?
Well, that's a great question. I think first let's just acknowledge that since last year, right around this time, when the starting gun went off as related to kind of AI interest on Capitol Hill, in particular legislation, you now have more than 50 bills in the House and 50 bills in the Senate. That said, not much has gotten passed, absent a few provisions that were in the last National Defense Authorization Act. There hasn't been a lot of movement on the actual pieces of legislation, at least at the federal level. I think a big bright spot has been the fact that they are bipartisan, bicameral bills largely, and that is a good indication. But I think part of the process of the Gang of Four, part of the new AI task force, is to help give some momentum to some of the bills here at the federal level in terms of, can some of the states pass legislation and some local regulations? I think they certainly could. I think the other thing to watch out for kind of in this lane is also what the courts do, because that'll play a large role in terms of AI regulation, both at the federal level as well as the state and local level. But I'll hand it over to my colleagues for any further thoughts.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that I think it's important to look at the AI policymaking conversation or process not as a race to a clearly defined outcome, but as an iterative process that I think will be incremental and kind of continue to evolve, not just over the rest of this year, but frankly for the foreseeable future. I think there's still a lot of work in Washington being done to really understand the technology, to understand the industry, all the use cases, all of the geopolitical implications, and to be deliberate in advancing policy that is maximally in the interest of the U.S. and its citizens and its industries, and to kind of take a first do no harm approach. And so I would not be at all surprised if some states move more aggressively than the federal government does. But I do think both at the state and federal level, this will be a process that really unfolds over the long haul as the technology continues to evolve and it continues to be more and more well integrated into our lives, and we kind of better understand what works and what doesn't, and what's necessary and what's not from a policymaking and regulatory standpoint.
Yeah, the only other thing I'd add is you think President Biden's executive order, I think, was an attempt to get ahead of some of the state and local regulations, as well as to try to catch up with some of what our international partners are doing around the globe. So I'll just kind of note that as well.
Yeah, and I think sorry, Teresa, to triple tap this, but agree with Reggie and Hans. I mean, I think it's, as you saw from the roundtables last year and into this year, folks are trying to get this right and take their time. And it's admittedly also a moving target. There's new application and new technology. It iterates at a rapid scale as it's supposed to. So I think it's going to be a deliberate march, to Reggie's point.
Our next question that has the highest number of votes here is, I think, a really good next progression from the first one. Is that if the federal government passes sweeping AI legislation, how does it come into conflict with states that might pass things earlier? Or how does that overlap work?
Well, the beauty of federal supremacy is that the federal law will, if there is a conflict, will ultimately govern, right? Like typically what happens is the states will advance legislation, make laws, and then that will inform the federal policymaking process, because home state senators and members of Congress often want to do things that are in harmony with what their states have already done. And there are lessons learned from the so-called laboratories of democracy that kind of scale up to the federal level. But to the extent those conflicts do arise, the most likely outcome is that the federal law will govern and it will become the law of the land.
Yeah, I think a lot of federal lawmakers recognize that they want to get ahead of that curve in terms of too many states and local governments passing regulation, and they're moving forward as quickly as they can. I think they're hearing in particular from stakeholders that it's going to be difficult for stakeholders, especially global ones, to comply not only with whatever the US puts forward, but the UK and the EU and others. So there is a strong effort to look at what the federal government does to ensure that those that have to comply with all these various rules and regulations aren't having to go back and look at a whole bunch of different setups for each individual state or locality or country that they're in.
Awesome. Next, we have got, what are the limits of the federal government's ability to regulate AI in your observation, whether structural, knowledge gaps, something else?
How to say that? So there are limits. Many of them actually exist by design, right? Like the federal government, we're not at the point in this process where the federal government, working as it is intended, would have a comprehensive regulatory structure in place. There aren't very many examples of Washington preemptively regulating an agency or an industry or a technology. It is designed to be kind of a lagging indicator. The states are designed to go first. The federal government learns lessons from the states. You take the best practices, you scale them up. And also the consensus building process in Washington is onerous by design. And that's just, you have a 60 vote threshold in the Senate, with the minority having considerable ability to kind of frustrate the majority's agenda. You have constant turnover in the House, both individual members and the party in power. You have the Administrative Procedures Act and the restrictions on federal rulemaking in the executive branch. And then you have the Supreme Court as a check on both bodies, and all three are kind of interacting together as impediments to progress of either branch. And the goal there is to ensure that whatever action Washington does take, because it is so impactful, and in alluding to that previous comment about supremacy, because it does ultimately become the law of the land to ensure that in a country as big as ours, as diverse of ours, both diversity in terms of lived experience, but also ideology and viewpoints, that whatever that final consensus is actually reflective of the breadth of thought and opinion in the nation. So I think the limitations, as they are often described, are actually features of the process. And what we're seeing now is Washington work as it's intended, which is a significant amount of information gathering, of education, of stakeholder engagement, public-private partnerships, and cooperation, building towards some eventual consensus. But the consensus building process often takes a decade or more, and I think we're kind of right in the middle of what will be a long and drawn out process that hopefully at the end will build consensus that is coherent and enduring, because obviously that would be in the interest of both industry and civil society and everyone else in between.
In terms of kind of limitations, this is a really unique issue. This is an issue that almost any committee can claim jurisdiction on in one area or another. And so when you have so many members of Congress that have kind of disparate interest in AI and have the ability to hold hearings, to introduce legislation, it's difficult to kind of corral that into some sort of broader consensus, to Reggie's point. So I think that is going to be a challenge. I think that's part of the rationale for the Gang of Four. And I think you're going to see more of the committees of jurisdiction kind of looking at individual AI issues through their committee responsibilities. In terms of other limitations, one big limitation, I think, is the president's executive order, is one of the most far-reaching executive orders that we've ever seen. A number of new mandates, new responsibilities for agencies across the federal government were put in place. But one thing that really wasn't was additional funding. So in terms of limitations, I think we should look at the appetite by Congress in light of the current environment, especially in the House, how much opportunity there is for things like research and development, for further funding to ensure that NIST and Commerce and DOJ have all of those funds they need to implement the EO and all the other responsibilities that are being contemplated in a lot of different pieces of legislation. So when I think about limitations, I think funding is certainly going to be is going to become more and more front and center.
Yeah, I think it's important. Reggie's comment that while there's a lot that's new about AI and that's unique about AI, that to some extent it's a similar limitations that any bill deals with right now, that it is hard to get policy through Congress with the partisan breakdowns, with the broader electoral landscape, and all of those kinds of hurdles that exist beyond this industry in general. So this next question is, which types of AI legislation represents the biggest threats? Which states are most active? Now, of course, threats mean different things to different people. So I think we can frame this of what right now seems like the most likely to move forward. If we see threat as like most likely to be put into action, where do you see those kind of first mover next steps in states or federal level?
At least at the federal level, I think for a long time, there was a race to define what AI is. And as Reggie pointed out, now there's kind of a big education component. And when you talk with members, despite those committees we were just talking about that they sit on and the various interests, one issue that I think really resonates is national security and defense, in particular China. And so when you think about threats, that is a big motivator, competition in particular with countries like China and potentially some of our other adversaries. And I think that is also something that when you look at legislation out there could move. When you look at in an environment where we're having difficulty just, funding the federal government, what pieces of legislation could actually move? There needs to be a driver for that, whether that's elections, or the National Defense Authorization Act. I think that those are opportunities where there are actual threats that at least policymakers are looking at. So that would be the big one I would put up there, would be, again, kind of competition with our adversaries in terms of being a threat that motivates Congress and the administration.
Yeah, Teresa, just to follow up on that, Hans is exactly right. And to, I think, all of our opening comments about this being sort of an iterative, long-term process, it's going to take a while to play out. I do think you will continue to see near-term AI high watermarks legislatively in NDAA, as Hans says, Senate Intel Committee, House Intel as well. To Hans's point, those are the most sort of the alligators closest to the boat that I think are easiest to capitalize on the bipartisan consensus of the national defense, national security threat.
I like that metaphor, alligators closest to the boat. I'm going to steal that one. So next question relates to existing data privacy policies and how AI will impact those, either federal data privacy, state data privacy policies.
Well, this is the big gap existing in the federal regulatory structure that probably needs to be plugged at some point if you're going to implement the kind of comprehensive regulatory framework that many often envision. The president, in unveiling the executive order that Hans mentioned earlier, identified comprehensive federal data privacy legislation as a key component that Congress needed to consider as part of any AI regulatory effort. The chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee has identified data privacy, comprehensive data privacy, as a top priority that should be pursued perhaps even before AI regulation. And the problem with both those positions is that Congress to date has shown a complete inability to move forward on this issue in a comprehensive way. And so I think it's both important to identify the kind of critical nature of a comprehensive data privacy regulatory framework to any maximally effective AI regulatory framework, but also to be realistic about whether such a framework is going to be passed in DC anytime soon. And if the answer is no, as history suggested would be, looking to the states and seeing some of the movement there, starting on the West Coast and moving across the country with kind of state-by-state adoption of convergent data privacy frameworks that are actually coming together in a way that I think avoid some of the concerns that have previously been relayed about a patchwork. There's a lot more overlap or convergence to the bills that are being passed in the state houses, and that speaks to the previous point about the states advancing policies, serving as laboratories of democracy, and eventually having those policies ladder up into some type of national framework that ultimately Washington is able to embrace. And so it's entirely possible that while DC is pondering AI and all things AI, both national defense, national security, and elsewhere, that states will continue to act on data privacy. There's some movement on the issue in Congress, though not on a comprehensive framework, and that the two issues can come together at some point in the near future. But it certainly seems as though at the moment that there is more momentum behind capacity building and laying a foundation for AI policy and AI regulation than there is for comprehensive data privacy. And obviously that will leave something to be desired in terms of the ultimate regulatory framework.
Yeah, I think Reggie's absolutely right. If you look at who some of the players have been the most involved on AI legislation and the hearings in Congress, those are the same ones that have been involved in data privacy. And I think, like AI, it's one of those issues everyone can kind of wrap their head around. Yeah, we need to do something about data privacy and we need to do something about AI. But when it comes to the particulars and the nuances and the specifics, it becomes a lot more difficult. And just to echo what Reggie said, at least on the House side, the Energy and Commerce Committee has been one of the committees that's been the most forward-leaning on AI. They've had a series of hearings on everything from national security to workforce to energy. But the overall kind of theme was that we also need data privacy legislation in conjunction with anything related to artificial intelligence. So it is still of interest to Congress, and maybe this will be a springboard for further interest. But I think as of right now, they're kind of separating those two issues a little bit, at least when it comes to the pieces of legislation that you've seen recently.
So this next question, I think, is one that maybe we even should have started with. Is there a standard definition of AI that we should be aware of and use when thinking about AI in policy and personal use? Obviously, generative AI has been the big push of the last year, but we know that AI was not invented last year and that there are ways it's impacted us in systems before that. So what is kind of do you all have a definition that you are thinking about, or how are they tackling that definition as we go through the legislative process?
No, this is actually one of the questions that needs to be answered before we can answer all the other questions, right? Because for some people, there is a very technical definition and it's rooted in the way that the systems operate. For some people, for others, any automated decision-making process is an artificial intelligence process. And so the scope of regulation is obviously tied necessarily to the definition that one uses in advancing the regulation. And there is not yet consensus on a definition in kind of the macro sense, but also in individual context. And so this question actually highlights or underscores how much work there is to be done on this issue, which is we have to actually come to a consensus on what the issue is before even starting to build consensus on how to go about addressing it. So it's actually a fantastic question. You're right; it would have been a perfect leadoff, but this is one of the many issues that's vexing Washington when it comes to artificial intelligence. Is just figuring out what the hell artificial intelligence actually is.
No, 100%. I think when you talk about the education of members and then of their constituents, I think one of the things that's of interest, at least to the Gang of Four potentially, is helping the general public. I mean, everyone on this webinar is well aware of what AI is and maybe what it isn't, but there's a lot of people in the public who don't know what AI is, how concerned they should be, what they should be concerned about. So I think you could see some very basic education efforts around what AI is, but Reggie's right. There's no standard definition, although the executive order tried to set out a few kind of standard definitions about some of the issues around AI, but you hear a lot of people talking about closed and open source, and there's still no definitions that are definitive on those items as well. So it's a really great question. I have at a later time a really funny story about what my mother thought AI was when I had a conversation first about her, but we can say that for another webinar.
Yeah, it's one of that fun games, my parents know what my job is kind of situation. So next question dives in a little bit to the, I guess you could say, head start that has happened in the EU in that legislation. In terms of GDPR, saw a lot of companies start to adopt GDPR in the US with the kind of theory that someday a similar law would be passed. How do you see the influence of the AI EU Act in the US?
I would say it's a bit too early to tell, which is the most unsatisfying answer one can give in a forum like this. And given that the question was asked specifically in the context of in-house counsel, I would harken back to one of the few things that I remember from law school, which is I would advise you to seek counsel from someone who specializes in these issues. This is something that I know folks at our firm and elsewhere are still unpacking and trying to figure out what the long-term implications are going to be, but I have not yet come across anyone who has a comprehensive and or satisfying answer as to how exactly those who are impacted or anticipate they will be impacted should proceed in this stage.
Yeah, I agree with Reggie. We had the pleasure of going over to the UK to kind of talk about some of these issues, and nobody had a good answer to this question. Not that will help you sleep any better at night. I presume that this is an in-house counsel asking this question, but I agree with Reggie. It is certainly something to track and make sure that you're working with counsel that fully understands kind of some of the timelines and other mandates that are associated with those efforts, whether they're in the EU or the UK or elsewhere.
I think you generally punt on sleeping well at night once you decide to go to law school. So it's kind of right in line with the career path.
This is just another day in the office, right? So next question is about specifically AI in the hiring process, giving growing concerns around potential bias. Do you have anything to elaborate on the state of legislation regarding the regulation of automated employment decision tools throughout the country?
Yeah, this is an area where there has been some movement, right? New York City has passed some ordinances to deal with the use of AI tools and automated decision-making tools in hiring decisions. And it's an area because it is kind of so deeply connected or so closely connected to something that deeply impacts people's day-to-day lives is likely to gain political momentum. It is not a question that has generated a ton of activity to date in DC. I do think that this is one topic that's probably more likely to be tackled on not just a state by state, but even a jurisdiction by jurisdiction level, actually city level policies dealing with hiring. And it's another thing that, again, as the technology becomes more well understood, as practitioners get more and more familiar with the strengths and weaknesses and how best to use it, I think some potential opportunities will present themselves, but also some issues or cause for concern. I think as we learn in real time what these systems are or are not well suited to do, we'll see legislation, whether it be city level ordinance, state level bills, or eventual federal regulations are laws that are designed to mitigate the anticipated harms. And the EEOC is anticipating potential rulemaking here. It's not clear exactly what direction that might go, but it's another area where the capacity building process is underway, stakeholder engagement, fact finding, just to better understand what the pros and cons are. So again, to regulate or legislate in a way that maximizes the benefits, minimizes the harms, and does so in a way that shows some understanding of what it is we're actually dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an issue, and it's one of those issues that's kind of similar to the financial services industry. When you're talking about issues that have a direct impact on people's lives, and people are affected by these, and the perception is that maybe that was not the intended effect, and they go talk to their members of Congress, that is something from a constituent standpoint you can see driving members even further and getting more engaged on. I think right now, in terms of the question, what is the current, state of legislation? I think there's been legislation that's been introduced. Most of it, like a lot of these other proposals, is focused on things like transparency. And we were talking about what's the definition of AI, and so where's the data coming from? What are the algorithms being used, and why is it, why is this the end product coming out? But I do agree with Reggie. I think it's going to continue to be of interest, and you probably see more action, not just at the federal level, but the state level, and then you could even see some potential action within the courts.
Okay, so we've got a lot of association professionals on the call who are probably getting a lot of questions from their members. And so for folks who work for trade associations, what are kind of the high level talking points that are important to reinforce as they are going about their work?
I'm not sure if this is asking about using AI or engaging on AI policy. I will take it from the latter standpoint. And I would say it's important to reinforce that the conversation is open at the moment. There are not a lot of preconceived notions. The battle lines haven't been drawn. There is a tremendous amount of opportunity for actual engagement and education of decision makers, because there is an understanding in Washington, official Washington, that there is a sophistication in industry around the use of these tools in myriad use cases that is an asset as folks try to figure out exactly what it is that they should be concerned about or excited about. And so this is an opportunity, I think, for fulsome engagement, for member level, for regulatory engagement and education, and just getting DC better equipped to understand what it is that they're actually going to be doing if they're regulating in this space, right? There's been a lot of conversation in the past few months about large language models and kind of the ChatGPT phenomenon that has triggered a lot of the conversation around AI in DC, but the conversation around manufacturing, around transportation, around decision-making and hiring, around housing, around financial services, there are lots of topics that are still being unpacked. And this is an opportunity, unlike most, where the kind of tribal lines are clearly drawn and everyone has predisposed positions, where there is a high degree of openness and a high degree of ability to persuade and to really shape policy outcomes on the front end. And I think a lot of the work that's being done now, while it might not all lead to legislation that gets signed into law by the end of this year or rulemaking that is finalized by the end of this year, I think a lot of the foundation will be laid. A lot of the future policy making endeavors will be informed by this moment of hyper education. And so getting in now, really setting the terms of debate and setting yourself up for success as we move through, again, a multi-Congress long, kind of decade-long effort to establish a regulatory framework, I think will serve you and your members well.
Yeah, I think Reggie put it really well. I think it's also a really, really good question in the sense that I think trade associations are really well positioned to play somewhat of an outside role when it comes to where the legislation is headed. Because when you look at what individual agencies have done, and if you look at a lot of the specific pieces of legislation, you see, to Reggie's point, a lot of frameworks, a lot of blueprints, a lot of task force and working groups, and it's an opportunity to be a voice for a number of the stakeholders. And I think there's some reservation by some to be kind of the tip of the spear on these issues. And so using the trade association to be a larger voice is really a helpful thing to do. So I think you'll see associations be more and more involved. I think you could see new associations form and new coalitions form as well, centered around AI. The one kind of piece of advice I would give to associations, and they're probably already doing this, is to make sure you are picking a lane and being a good resource to Congress and the administration on specific issues, not just that you want to go in and talk about these issues, because I think with a number of members, especially the ones that are leading these efforts, are kind of past that point, and they want to know, like, what do you have to add? How can you be helpful? And why are you a resource? And so to the extent that trade associations can answer those questions and be very specific on healthcare or biosecurity issues or on financial services issues or on national security issues, I think that's a important role. And I agree 100% with Reggie that it is an opportunity to get in there now and start having those conversations.
Yeah, and again, not to kick a dead horse here, but or to continue using aphorisms. Sorry, Teresa. I think there's a huge, the member education component is both a challenge and an opportunity, as Hans and Reggie have both said. I do think there is a tremendous amount of organic interest and curiosity with rank and file members, like Hans just mentioned. Folks that maybe are not at these AI roundtables, not part of the inner circle, that are sort of on the first go round of hashing out what sort of policy framework or roadmap looks like. So to Hans and Reggie's point, I think it's a great moment in time to engage with members. And again, with Reggie's caveat that this is not a real opportunity, given that historically in DC it's very tribal, us versus them. This at least at this point in time remains a bipartisan, organic, high level of curiosity. People want to hear from all sides. So I want to encourage everyone to engage.
And one other thing I'd add there, just kind of a pro tip: if it's possible to credibly frame your engagement within the context of contributing to U.S. competitiveness, U.S. leadership globally on AI, if you can even go as far as to connect it to the U.S.-China competition, that there's an appetite for engagement on that front that I think will leave you well suited to find a very receptive audience.
That's an awesome tip to end on, and really tactical. Next question: are we going to see more overarching legislation that governs the use of AI in all areas, or will we see more towards certain business areas like banking, housing, finance, fintech, etc.?
Yeah, we're not going to have a U.S. AI Act, right? It's not. There was a lot of talk early on, and even the term early on, I think it undersells how long the AI conversation has been going on in Washington. But in the past 18 months, lots of talk about a U.S. AI agency or comprehensive AI legislation. I think as members have gotten more familiar with the issue, more familiar with the technology, there is a growing consensus that a sector-specific approach is the best and most likely to succeed. I think the EO is, in large part, very sector-specific, with the exception of the kind of large frontier model regulatory framework that it's trying to establish. But housing is housing, fintech is fintech, right? There's a difference in using AI to tell me how much my plane ticket is going to cost versus using AI to tell me what type of cancer treatment I should receive. It's just that there's orders of magnitude of difference in the use cases, and I think there's become a growing appreciation of the need for a differentiated approach to regulating, depending on the sector, depending on the use case, and depending on the potential harms and benefits that one might anticipate given those aforementioned factors.
Yeah, I agree with Reggie. I mean, I think for a long time there was a lot of stakeholders saying we got to hurry up and catch up with our international partners like the EU and the UK. But a lot of regulators were balancing that with, we want to make sure we don't do anything that stifles innovation and keeps the United States at the forefront of development. And I think now what you're seeing is exactly what Reggie said, is looking at these more in a siloed conversation and specific to the committees and what is the most pressing issues that we collectively need to look at, whether it's to the previous question about, do I get a job or do I get a loan, or how do we ensure child safety when it comes to the use of AI, or how do we ensure that China is not developing faster than the United States, and what do we need to do to combat that? Like, all of those are opportunities and probably be looked at more in a segmented fashion, as opposed to like some sort of overarching effort.
Yeah, and Teresa, the only thing I'd add to that is a temporal component, right? Like, everyone on this call knows that in Washington, managing floor time, whether it's the Senate or the House, is priority, high priority, and there's a seasonality to legislative progress in Washington and with Congress. So, for instance, we've seen, you have the FAA bill right now. We're in the middle of appropriations season. You've got a highway bill that's going to have to go next Congress. There's going to be natural moments, into the previous observations and offerings by Reggie and Hans, that NDAA and a few of these annual bills will be natural opportunities. But there are also these large policy silo-specific vehicles that will come around every 2-3 years that will provide opportunities for people to legislate and overlay AI into these particular lanes. So.
And I think this is a distinction that actually should inform engagement strategy, right? Like, there's a lot of attention paid to kind of the people who have established themselves as overall AI leaders. My former boss, obviously chief among them, but to the extent that you are a financial services provider or housing organization, like the engagement with the committees, engagement with the regulators, engagement with the stakeholders that you normally engage with is actually a very prudent path, because it's important to know what they are thinking on AI, as they will likely be the people and the entities making decisions as to how AI is applied in your sector or in your industry. And so there's an advantage to building on those existing relationships, tapping into those institutions that you're already engaged to, and just broadening that conversation out to be more AI specific, with the understanding that those are likely going to be the places from which the AI policy that impacts you will ultimately originate.
Great. Next question is about a more specific bill. So reaction to the new Utah private sector AI bill looks to have 3 key components. Specifies that Utah's consumer protection laws apply equally to an entity's use of generative AI as they do to other activities. Requires private sector entities to take steps to disclose to use of generative AI, and creates the Office of Artificial Intelligence Policy, charged with administering an artificial intelligence learning laboratory program. So wondering if you all have any familiarity with this and any reactions.
I will say that I am as familiar with it as your last 15 seconds of background would allow one to be. But even in that 15 seconds, there are some, I would say, increasingly universal trends that are illustrative of how the process is unfolding and likely will continue to unfold. So you have clarification that existing law that applied before generative AI applies after generative AI, right? And that's one of the things that I think has happened in the last 18 months in Washington, is the realization that despite the initial feeling that there needed to be a new regulatory agency or a completely new kind of comprehensive law, that there are already existing laws that prohibit some of the behaviors that people are worried about either originating or being exacerbated with the use of generative AI. And so clarifying that existing law applies now as it does then, that is a thing that I expect will continue at the federal, state, and local level. There's the capacity building component of it, establishing offices and organizations that are dedicated to just streamlining and kind of targeting resources and public education. There was a lot of that in the executive order, and I expect there have been a lot of federal bills introduced to that effect, and I expect there will continue to be. And the second one you said, can you repeat it? Because I got lost in my...
Yes, requires private sector entities to take steps to disclose and or respond to inquiries about their use of generative artificial intelligence.
Yes, and so that speaks to the anxiety about what it means to have a potential kind of deluge of synthetic media out in the world and not necessarily have a citizenry that is well equipped to engage with that media in the kind of safest and most sophisticated way. And so that it's in line with the capacity building component, that there's also a public education piece of this is needed, and kind of a Scouts honor dynamic. And so I think it's important to note that the bill does not, as far as I can tell, regulate the development or deployment of said systems. It just requires that you say that the system has been deployed in this way. And that speaks in a lot of ways to the limitations as to how ambitious you can be with reining in companies' activity, as opposed to ensuring that activity proceeds in a way that is conducive with existing legal and regulatory frameworks. And so it reads to me as a bill that is in line with kind of where we are in this stage, where it's just saying, hey, everything that was true 2 years ago is true today, and now we'll take some time to figure out what, if any, new authorities are needed moving forward in the slow and deliberative way that we spoke about before.
Awesome. Thanks for that level of analysis after just reading through it for 15 seconds is pretty impressive. So with that, I want to flag folks, we've got a little over 15 minutes left. So remember to use that upvote, as we could probably do 2 more hours with the number of questions that we have. But I know folks are busy on Fridays. So our next question, how can Congress ensure that economic benefits from advancement in AI reach the average working American? How can legislation ensure increases in productivity do not just lead to more wealth concentration, but rather dispersed benefits?
This is a very big question.
Yeah.
So I guess I could take a first crack at that. So part of it is, I think it is encouraging that we are seeing so much engagement, so much skepticism, for lack of a better word, but also so much more curiosity at this stage in this iteration of this technology relative to what we saw at the advent of the social media age. I will say that, having been on the Hill as the the things started to turn a bit as it related to DC's relationship to the social media companies, I think there are some takeaways from that moment and that experience that members are trying not to repeat this time around. And so the mere fact that we have had dozens and dozens of hearings, that we've had all of this executive action, that there have been so many forums and roundtables and task force and kind of these capacity building entities at this stage, leaves one optimistic that, to the extent that the federal government is capable of establishing a framework that does achieve this goals, that they're doing everything possible to ensure that they're able to do so. Now, the question then is, frankly, whether I'm fond of saying that we get the Congress we deserve, right? And so if we are able to pass legislation that achieve these ends, it'll be because there was political mobilization and engagement by voters and by grassroots organizations and by interested stakeholders to produce that outcome. And so the question of whether we can ensure kind of disbursement of wealth, widespread prosperity, kind of broad benefits from these technologies will in large part be determined by whether or not the citizenry demands that of their elected officials. And frankly, that is a question that is, I'm humble enough to say, is far beyond my capacity to answer, because I am but one of the 300+ million who will make that decision.
Yeah, and maybe a more simple way of trying to say what Reggie is people are impatient. And so, we had all of this activity that said AI is this tremendous risk. And you had a number of really leading intellectuals signing letters saying it's on par with a number of other very extreme risks. And but it also is going to make tremendous advancements and make all of our lives better. And so to the extent that that doesn't happen fast enough and people remain impatient, I think that could impact, the momentum behind a lot of this legislation too. Like if it's not moving as quickly as a lot of people anticipated, you could see some of the attention being directed elsewhere in the immediate term. Right now, I think there's a tremendous amount of attention by Congress in a very bipartisan way on these issues. But from a constituent standpoint, to the question, if things are not, moving as fast as they have been and start to slow down, or people don't see it day to day, then you could see Congress, again, focusing on other issues.
Yeah, and I do think.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, Teresa, I was just going to say, the process currently being run with, Senator Round, Senator Young, Reggie's old boss, Leader Schumer, they've endeavored to produce some sort of pathway forward that is, understandably slid to the right a little bit given the delay in the appropriations process and just the beginning of Congress altogether. But I do think, that would be a seminal moment, having, a work product for folks to sort of take charge and move out committee-wise. Now, where it goes from there is, to Hans and Reggie's points, completely unknowable. But I do think, they're taking every effort to, take it slow, do it right the first time.
Well, a perfect segue of what is the right pace to take this, and what is the pace that we're capable of. Will AI regulation be quick enough to address issues in misinformation, disinformation in an election year?
Legislation in Washington is never quick enough to do anything. It's just not the way that it works, right? Like necessarily a lag between what DC can do and what people feel is needed. And I think there is a ton being done to figure out how to best educate the public in terms of sophistication in dealing with synthetic media, how to understand and spot deepfakes and things like that. I think there's a lot of collaboration between industry and government on this issue that is healthy and I think is encouraging. But in terms of regulation, particularly in the kind of information communication space, particularly as it relates to an election, that is a dicey topic. And I think you should prepare that there will be inefficiencies in that process that likely mean that whatever you feel Washington needs to do to maximally impact this issue, it's not going to be that. And so partnerships between private entities, partnerships between companies and government, coalitions of secretaries of state, and just the looking to that type of activity, I think particularly in election year is important. And then watching how the conversation unfolds in the Senate Rules Committee and the House Administration Committee and seeing what, if any, consensus can be built there is important. But to quick enough to address the issues, I don't think so, because of how fast information spreads and how deliberate Washington is, particularly when it comes to legislating, particularly on difficult issues, and anything dealing with election law is difficult. So I am not wildly optimistic that you will see a law or a rulemaking come out of DC this year that averts whatever crisis one might be most concerned about in this sector or this sphere.
Yeah, and I agree with Reggie. I don't see any legislation necessarily coming out. Although I had a friend that was fond of saying, Congress will ignore things up until the point then they totally overreact. So, maybe at some point if something major happens, but
the problem there is the major thing means they necessarily weren't quick enough, right?
Yeah. So yeah, fair point. But you have seen just this week, more and more legislation coming out to address the deep fake issue, to help election administrators, deal with these types of issues. And then you've even seen letters to DOJ and others, requesting help when it comes to this type of information. And then you even have, some of the candidates saying that some of their remarks are being altered by AI already, and so they have the luxury of using that too as a excuse for maybe some slip-ups.
And I think, Ryan, unless you have one thing I'd add, I think it's useful to look back to 2020 and kind of remembering how broadly disrupted our election system was in the midst of the pandemic. And there was a ton of work being done, not only by government, but also by civil society, nonprofits, companies, just celebrities and people with public platforms to basically strengthen the election system through public information. And I think that kind of cross-sector collaboration is going to be necessary here, because everyone is going to have to kind of leverage whatever their strengths or their contributions can be, understanding that there's not going to be kind of a magic wand fix that comes from DC that is able to avert all of the anticipated harms here.
I'm going to cheat our system a little bit and share a question that I am interested in. What members of Congress are most well read on these issues and have staff that are sophisticated in their approach to AI?
Those could be two very different questions.
Is this being recorded? I can't remember.
We're not online, are we?
I'll let you guys speak to the Republican side first.
Well, I mean, certainly from the Senate side, you've seen, as I said earlier, Senator Rounds and Senator Young, I think, have taken up the torch and really run and both have jurisdictional committee areas of focus, but I think both are organically very focused on this, have very smart staffs. I'll do the classic Washington hedging. There are many other Republicans in the Senate, on the Senate side and in the House side, and Hans can speak to the House side, that are focused on this, that are either part of the various working groups. And I think, at least in our engagement with staff on AI policy issues, machine learning, et cetera, there's, as I said, very, very serious organic eagerness to learn more about the threat environment, but also the solution set. So, Hans, I don't know what Hans or Reggie, over to you.
No, and I'll defer to by saying I think it depends on the issue, because you have different members with different expertise. But at least on the House majority and minority side, you saw even with the last speaker who kind of had a natural constituency with a number of companies close by his district or within his district talking to him already about these issues. He had a desire to put together a working group, which is now the House task force. And if you look at the task force, you see that Mr. Johnson and Mr. Jeffries put together a good mix of members. You have the full political spectrum. You have good geographic diversity, diversity in terms of the committees that are there to kind of think about these issues. Mr. Obernolte on the Republican side obviously is one that the speaker relies a lot on. But again, I think a lot of these can be confined to specific issues, whether that's workforce, deepfakes, election, child safety, national security. There's a number of members that are well read into these issues and are interested in them. And I think you'll see that interest only increase as we move forward. It'll be really interesting to see what that House AI task force puts forward, because at least one of their members, Mr. Beyer, indicated that he wants to see 4 to 10 pieces of legislation maybe come out of that, and to see what pieces of legislation are first out of the gate will kind of also demonstrate, what issues could be most pressing. I don't have any insight there. I think they've only met once as a group to date, and so I think they're still thinking through the cadence of what they're going to put out and how that's going to operate. And probably similar to the Senate side, at the end of the day, it'll be the committees that'll be looking at these issues more closely and actually putting out the legislation.
Yeah, and I would say any committee chair or any committee ranking member has a staff that is sophisticated in their approach to AI, because there is a tremendous amount of staff level energy and attention on this issue. And you can go to any committee and find at least someone who has been kind of really deep in the weeds on this for, if not just the past year and a half, then for years now. And so all of the chairs and rankers are well staffed. And if you look to members who have led on individual issues in the past, it is highly likely that they have now kind of gotten themselves to a point where they're more sophisticated on how that issue intersects with artificial intelligence. So, for example, Senator Klobuchar, who is the chair of Senate Rules, has long been a leader on election policy, and she is now introducing bipartisan bills on AI in the election context, right? And it's really, we're starting to see a maturation of this process where members are starting to understand how AI impacts the areas that they have already kind of staked claim to, and are really refining their approaches to legislating in that space. And I think Representative Liu is someone in particular who I think wasn't mentioned, who's really good on this. Senator Heinrich as well, who I believe co-founded the AI caucus in the Senate.
Yeah.
And Chuck Schumer, I think I'm constitutionally obligated to say Chuck Schumer is great on everything. So yeah, awesome guy.
I was gonna say, you're gonna forget that. No, yeah, the Armed Services Committee and the Intel committees, both House and Senate. Senators Reid and Wicker in the instance of the Senate have an incredible staff focused on this. So for anyone interested, that would be among my first steps.
Yeah, I think a theme we've seen on a couple of these questions now is we're moving from this idea that AI is kind of a standalone issue to the AI is infiltrating all of the issues that lots of folks are already working on. And so taking it from the lens of the areas that you have expertise, rather than feeling like needing to build it up as kind of a standalone, is a theme I think we've covered in a couple of different questions. So kind of covering 2 different questions here. We've got a couple about AI in the higher ed space. So this question here is about guidelines for responsible use, but we do also have one about legislation or regulation on AI in higher education, kind of broadly in that umbrella. Any thoughts there?
I do not have any guidelines for responsible use in AI or in higher education, except to say you should consult your university's and student code of conduct and make sure that you don't get kicked out for your use of a chatbot. In terms of legislation, nothing that comes to mind, which doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, just that it doesn't come to mind. And this is another one of those issues that is not just hyper local in terms of like the state or city level, but in recent years, it's been hyper local down to the household level. And so it's not an area where Congress, or really Washington typically, advances significant mandates outside of a few high profile examples, but I'm not aware of a ton of movement on the legislative front on AI in higher education, or at least in terms of the guidelines and how it should be used. But I defer to Hans and Ryan if there's something I'm missing there.
No, I think you you hit it, Reggie. I mean, I think the big concern is how students are using it, and whether that's productive or whether that's unproductive, and hurting or helping their education. And it's a lot for a higher education to navigate. I think more with K through 12, Congress is really looking at that too, because they're hearing from stakeholders about some of the advantages of AI specific to kind of how individual students learn and how that can be put to use to make sure that students are getting the best possible kind of baseline education. By the time you get to higher education, I think it becomes a little bit more difficult issue.
Awesome. We are about at our last 2 minutes. And so since we are not going to get through the rest of our couple dozen questions we've got here, I'll remind folks that in that docs tab, we've got the Akin Intelligence newsletter to stay up to date. But wanted to see if you all have any kind of last thoughts, things we haven't touched on that is top of mind for you all as we go through the rest of this legislative session and lead into an election in the area of AI policy.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in first real quick. I mean, I think as we talked about, there's a lot of different overlay potential for AI in various policy lanes. I think there's continuing discussion of permitting reform making its way through Congress, regardless of what you think, how optimistic that is or not. There's clearly an opportunity and appetite to simplify the energy and just infrastructure permitting process, streamlining that using AI. And I also think something that Reggie, Hans, and I have talked about with several clients is the energy demands for AI compute power and data centers, and how that's been in the headlines as of late. And I think it's going to only continue to pick up steam. So thank you, Teresa.
Teresa, I just encourage everyone to take a look at those docs you put in the chat, and happy to be a resource in any capacity moving forward.
Absolutely.
As a general rule of thumb, if you're trying to figure out whether a policy is or is not viable, just try to find a recent kind of analogous policy or policy fight, see how that played out, and realize that the AI conversation is not necessarily disconnected from that. It's going to be rooted in a lot of the historical disagreements or agreements that we've seen, particularly in recent past. So there are historical examples that can help you to assess whether or not something is or is not viable. And to Hans's point, we stand at the ready, happy to assist with that if anyone desires.
Awesome. And thank you again for your time. Our next AMA session will be coming up in April, covering transportation and infrastructure. So look out for emails from us there. And thanks again for joining us.